I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guests today are Doctors Ksera Dyette and Natasha Holmes. Dr. Ksera Dyette is a 31-year-old cisgender Black West Indian woman who is a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist in Massachusetts. She is an immigrant, intersectional feminist, and social justice-oriented clinician, and her unique story informs her clinical work. As a person with multiply intersecting, marginalized identities, Dr. Dyette does not get to hide some of these more important aspects of her identity, and so, though she is an analytically oriented therapist, she believes that the practice of being blank is a concept that did not have therapists who look like her in mind. Dr. Dyette maintains a private practice part-time called Cup of Tea Counseling, where she sees children, adolescents, adults, and families. She specializes in working with diverse abled individuals, specifically autism, developmental delays, and chronic health conditions. She also has extensive experience working with sexual trauma. Dr. Dyette spends the other portion of her professional time working for a juvenile court clinic, completing comprehensive psychological assessments for youth and their families who make contact with the system. Dr. Dyette's additional services include individual and parent coaching, schools consultation, and organizational consulting on race issues. You can follow her at Instagram at CT Counseling. Dr. Natasha Holmes is the founder and CEO of And Still We Rise, a group practice with the mission of increasing access to quality mental health care for communities of color by specializing in providing services to women and people of color seeking culturally informed care and providing individualized coaching and support to therapists of color who aim to develop their own private mental health practices. Dr. Holmes is a licensed psychologist, consultant, and life coach who works from a psychoanalytically and trauma-informed Black feminist and womanist perspective while integrating cognitive behavioral and dialectical behavioral theories. She serves on the steering committee for the Boston chapter of Reflective Spaces, Material Places, and is a Multicultural Concerns Committee Scholar for the American Psychological Association's Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology. For more, visit the text accompanying this episode for links. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. From Chapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. For more information, you can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
So I guess part of how I'm organizing myself is around this question that you were posing, Vanessa, on how did you find yourself in this field? I was also thinking about my experience within the psychoanalytic community, my experience as a psychologist, kind of more broadly too. So that's what I am anchored around. And with that in mind, I'll share a bit about how I ended up here. So I started graduate school in 2010, so 10 years ago, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that long ago, but in my head, that was a long time ago. 10 years, I cannot believe it's already been 10 years. But so I'm from, actually, before I even say that, I'm from Seattle. My family's in Seattle. What could I say briefly about my family? Well, so I guess since it's a podcast, I'll acknowledge it. So I'm a 32-year-old Black African-American cisgender woman. I'm a first-generation college student, so I'll acknowledge that too. I come from a working-class family. I'm a descendant of slaves. I will acknowledge that too in the space. And so yes, there's probably a whole story on how I even ended up as a psychologist, but I'll skip that piece and just go to 2010. So I moved from Seattle to Oregon, and I started in a graduate program. I later learned that I was the first African-American woman to graduate from that graduate program, which I was not aware of at the time. But I think that speaks to how few folks of color there were in this space. And for me to survive, that's the word that comes to my mind, is actually survive the space. It required coordinating with the few folks of color who were there, other like students of color who were there. And I also had a mentor, Sandra Jenkins, who was critical to my development, growth, becoming of a psychologist. But when I started grad school, I went to a clinical psychology program, and my plan was to study forensics specifically. So I was on the forensic track, and to train to work in the Bureau of Prisons, doing evaluations and such, and put in my so work for the government, put in my 20 years, retire, and that was going to be my career as a psychologist. And in my head, that's what I tied that's what I understood as like a stable work and like a promising career at the time. This is what I understood all that. Yeah. Oy. And my relationship to psychoanalysis, though, because I didn't understand psychoanalysis as something that would allow me to make money, or a space that had folks who looked like me in it, I like had this side relationship with psychoanalysis. I would like take classes on the side, or go to talks on the side. Or Sandra, actually, Sandy, she is psychoanalytically oriented. So that was like the only Black woman I saw doing this kind of work. I take classes, go to these talks that would happen once a month, like at people's houses. I was in analysis at the time too. And so it was all stuff I did on the side, but I didn't think I could actually make a career out of it or anything like that. Because when I thought of it, I would think of like old white men and wealthy people, which isn't like a population I was interested in working with, or a community that I thought I was a part of. So in 2013 or 2014, somewhere around there, I had a supervisor who told me that I was thinking like a slave. Now, this was a little harsh at the time, and I was insulted by it. I remember telling Sandy that the supervisor told me that. And he was a Black man who owned a group practice. That was important because it would probably mean something very different if a white man was telling me I was thinking like a slave. But I remember telling Sandy about it, and she laughed and found it quite entertaining. But it felt like an important moment in my career and moment in my development. What I came to understand what he was saying was that I was underestimating myself, and I had a pattern of underestimating myself. And yeah, I still kind of go back to that. And I'll probably say more about it later. But anyways, and then like 2014, I moved to Boston for my pre-doc internship, which was at the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology through Boston University, Boston Medical Center. And that was quite an experience, quite a move, completely cross-country. It was a pretty difficult time. I feel like that year was a tough year. I mean, pre-doc is sort of a tough year in general, I think, for a lot of folks, but yeah, that was a tough year. But it was around that time that I really started getting into the psychoanalytic community even more. So for my postdoc, I went to BIP, the Boston Institute for Psychotherapy was a psychoanalytic, it closed actually. But I trained there for a bit. I trained at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis for a bit in their like PGFP program. And I was working in community mental health and helped to get together or establish this Reflective Spaces Material Places Boston group, Boston chapter of the group. And so this is sort of what, that feels a little, I don't know how cohesive that is or if that all makes sense, but this has sort of been like some of my journey, some of my experience. I began teaching and I was working community mental health around that time. And then that brings me up to like 2017, which is when I quit all of that and then made this leap into a group practice. So like for-profit type of work, which I hadn't been doing. So when I think of my experience within the psychoanalytic community or experience as a psychologist, everything kind of started coming together in 2010 when I was in graduate school. And I have like these bits and pieces of like my experience of being a person of color, of planning to do work in like this sort of forensic setting and what that meant to me, what my relationship with psychoanalysis was and how that shifted with time. So I'm thinking of all of these kind of themes that eventually come together a bit more, but yeah. Does that sort of make sense or?
Yeah, for sure.
So,
and that's where you met Ksera?
And that's where I met Ksera. But before I talk anymore, I didn't know, Ksera, if you want to share a bit.
I was saying that it was interesting listening to you, Natasha, because I was remapping my journey as you were speaking. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is just feeling like everything that's been happening in the world makes it hard to think clearly in general, but also about my story and my narrative. I've been having a really difficult time. So it's a pretty unique experience that I'm having right now of being like, oh yeah, I have memories about these things. But I am recently 31 years old, cisgender, female, West Indian. I often will just say Black because to white Americans that doesn't mean a whole lot sometimes. But I am an immigrant, so I was born in Trinidad and came here pretty young. And it was the sort of usual story of we're coming here for a better life, we're coming here for education. And I didn't understand all of the nuances of that at the time, obviously. And so school and education and all of that was sort of always front and center. And I was the first person in my family to go to college. And it wasn't necessarily a super conscious decision. It was just sort of like, okay, this is the next step. And when I was in undergrad in Virginia Beach, which was the farthest south that I had been at the time, I majored in criminal justice, psychology, and philosophy. And so what I find interesting is this very similar forensic path that Natasha and I have. And at the time, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. And I was going to go to law school, and that was my focus. And I was like, I'm going to help people. I was very interested in the criminal mind and understanding human behavior, but I didn't really have a conceptualization yet, at least, of psychology as a thing I could do. So the major in criminal justice came first. And then as I was taking psychology courses, I was like, oh, this kind of feels a lot more aligned with where my mind has been moving and working. And so then that's when I started thinking about how do I marry these two things, and declared my major in psychology as well, and was thinking I'm going to work in prisons or something. So very, very similar. And, I think that it's hard to talk about this interest in forensics without the way in which people of color, Black people specifically, are often thinking about how we're giving back to our community. And obviously, so many Black people, particularly Black men, are concentrated in our prison systems. And so for me, I was thinking, how do I give back? But how do I also make a life for myself? And how do I do that in a way that's interesting? So these are all of the things that were going on in my mind. But I didn't know anything. I didn't have any way of grounding the idea of graduate school because no one in my family had ever done that before either. So I just started applying to a bunch of different programs. I applied to psychology programs. I applied to philosophy programs. So I applied for a program at Oxford. And so I kind of landed, as it were, at my grad program in 2011. And still with this mindset that I was going to do forensic psychology work. And I think it was my second year of grad school that they had somebody to come in and talk with us about what we were thinking we wanted to do in the future. And I was like, well, I want to have a hybrid of a private practice where I'm like working with people individually, but also like working in the system, like doing assessments. So I was becoming really interested in psychological assessment at the time. And this woman, she's a white woman, she said, that's not possible. And I was like, and I felt, I was very taken aback because my feeling was like, she's supposed to be here to encourage us about the paths that we're taking. And Natasha knows me. I'm a very stubborn, very direct individual. And my response to her was like, so what are you doing here? Like, if you're here, you're supposed to help us kind of figure out how we can get to what we want to do. And your answer is like, you can't do that, then why are you here? There are plenty of men who are doing this. I know that there are because some of them are my professors. So like, why not me? So I kind of had this thing fixed in my mind for a while, but I didn't really have any great conceptualization of how I would get there. And similar to Natasha, I had two very important mentors. I mean, I've had lots of mentors, but Monisha Akhtar, who is a psychoanalyst, she's a child and adolescent and adult psychoanalyst, and she's Bengali. I started doing research with her, and that's when I started to really get an idea of like, oh, this is how I can shape my future. And really under her mentorship, I got a lot of just inspiration for my future. And then I had another mentor, Marjorie Bosk, who I met with pretty regularly and would share my cases with and try to get more than what my on-site supervisors were offering me, and just trying to figure it out along the way. So I dabbled in various forensic things, working in community mental health settings. I did college counseling for internship as well, and also worked at a rape crisis center. So I did a lot of different things. And then I got this postdoc at Cambridge Health Alliance, Harvard Medical School, doing rotations on the inpatient child and adolescent units. Because by then I had sort of realized, I really like working with children and families as well. And did a developmental assessment rotation too. And yeah, when I landed at the company where we met, I just needed a job. And I interviewed and I was like, okay, this seems okay. And that's how I ended up at a group practice. So it wasn't even part of what I had conceptualized that I would be doing. But that's where I met Natasha. So that was 2017. And I think I forgot to say that my whole time during graduate training, I was pretty involved in the psychoanalytic community. So both my mentors were analysts, and I was our graduate student representative for our local chapter of Division 39. So I was doing programs. I was generating our flyers for those programs. I was helping with advertising. So I was doing a lot every week, every month, and also presenting. I had presented at the American Psychoanalytic Association as a student, and also volunteered as well. And that's how I sort of made my way into these spaces, is through volunteering. But we can talk about how sometimes I got mistaken as being sort of like the hotel help rather than a student who's attending the conference. That was something that occurred frequently in these spaces. So there was a lot of, I would call it violence, a lot of violence I felt that I experienced and contended with, but felt that psychoanalysis lent language to my experiences of migration that I didn't have, that really resonated with me. And that's why I have always held on to it as something that's been important in my work. So yeah, I think that's a good place to segue, I suppose. I don't know if you want to talk more about your experiences, Natasha.
Well, one of the things actually, as you're talking, that I found myself thinking about is like the pull into forensic work. And that didn't happen in a vacuum. Like, I didn't wake up and was just interested in forensic work. Mm-hmm. I also had an interest in going to law school. I didn't realize that you did too. But I remember there's a law school on my undergrad campus. I remember seeing the folks going into the law school, and they looked incredibly depressed and unhappy. Mm-hmm. And so in my head, I was thinking, I don't know if I want that. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how I stumbled into psychology, the psychology piece. But yeah, I think it's meaningful, the pull that I had at the time. And I remember Sandy pointing this out to me, like why are you interested in working in prisons and doing like this forensic work? And is it actually bringing you closer to, like, is there some sort of guilt that's underneath it? Mm. And yeah, which is like a whole other conversation probably, but
yeah. Well, that reminds me though of like even thinking about the decision to choose like psychology over social work, for example. You know, and I don't mean this in any particular way, but like the stereotype that I had was white people go into psychology, Black people go into social work. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I want to go against that stereotype. And I knew I would be incurring a lot of debt to do that. Like, I knew that. And people tried to talk me out of it. They were like, well, it would be cheaper to be a social worker. It would be cheaper for you. And I felt like, this is a way that the system keeps us in our place, so to speak. Not that I didn't know excellent social workers, but like people tried to talk me out of it. And I'm like, but if you look at the demographic makeup of these fields, it's, at least in present day 2011, it was mostly Black women going into social work and white women going into psychology. And I think that the forensic piece is also very related to that. Like, why might we feel more pulled to systems roles, where maybe we feel like we can make more impact or have more power or make change in people's lives who look like us in fundamental ways that they need. So I think, for me, that definitely relates to this forensics piece.
Yeah. And the way that I ended up at the group practice, like making this, because I was very much in community mental health and like teaching, and it was serving my community. It was working within my community. But when I graduated with my doctorate, I had accrued between undergrad and graduate school $410,000 of student loan debt. And it was not possible to survive. I remember helping one of my patients fill out their Medicaid form for food stamps, like a food stamp form rather. And I was familiar with doing it because I had to fill one out for myself. I'm filling one out for my damn self, like with a doctorate degree. And so I had to leap. I had to do something different because I couldn't afford to continue doing community mental health. Something had to be done. So that's how I ended up at a group practice, like doing this kind of for-profit stuff. But the reason I think Ksera and I keep referring to this group practice is because our strategies around, at least what comes up for me, or what's so clear about our experience there, is like our strategy around navigating that space and how different they were.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and what it means. And this is, I mean, as I thought about sitting with the two of you, with you, Vanessa, and Ksera, but I was thinking about like, what does it mean to be a person of color navigating like these white spaces? At least what does it look like in my life? And this group practice, I think, was a perfect example of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we both sort of ended up there for reasons related to survival, right? Like, it was either I find a job here or I move back to New York. Like, those were my options. And I needed something to pay the rent. Otherwise, I couldn't continue to stay here. And so, there was survival in that. And then, of course, as you alluded to, things that we did related to survival within that practice that were very different. Yeah. And maybe it would be helpful for me to start, because how you ended up thinking about what you were doing was very much related to my arrival there, I think, in some ways. Because I had decided, this was really funny, I was like, I'm going into these interviews with my hair curly, I'm not going to worry about like straightening it or whatever. And like, if they are interested in me and accept me as I am, as a Black woman, then this might be a good place to be. And at the time I didn't really ignore, I sort of rationalized away red flags. Like when I asked in my interview about what statistics they were keeping on demographics. And the answer I got was like, well, we don't really have a formal system for keeping track of that yet. And I was like, ooh, but I was like, I need a job. So I was like, well, maybe that's, like a small potatoes compared to what they're telling me I will be able to do here, which is create my own caseload and do assessment and all of these things that I really did want to do. And the people that I met, the other clinicians, they seemed like great people to work with. And so I ended up getting hired. But I was doing that under the pretense that I would be as authentically me as possible while I was there, which included even how I wear my hair, or standing up for things that were important to me, or expressing concerns when I saw something going on systemically that was problematic. But that caused some issues for me. And
I'm sorry.
we met, I think for the first time at a annual company meeting. And maybe you want to take it from there.
Oh, no. What I remember is Ksera raising her hand in this meeting and saying, so I don't even remember what the feedback was, but it was something about race, and it was something very transparent and honest. And I remember trying to stand up and turn around and see who the hell is talking like that.
I remember what it was. I remember exactly what it was, because we were talking about the election. And I felt like they were talking about it in such a way that they had assumed that everyone in the room had not voted for Trump. And I pointed that out. I was like, I feel like this conversation is making the assumption that everyone agrees with everyone in here. And if we're really going to have a real conversation, we have to acknowledge that that's probably not true. So that was the comment that I made. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I heard that, I remember thinking, "Oh, this is incredibly honest." And who is this? Who is this speaking like this? But then also, because I'm not making assumptions that the white folks I'm sharing space with are believing the things that I'm believing, or are have similar thoughts on politics that I might have, or something along these lines. And even as we're talking about this right now, I'm thinking about the overlap between how we navigated this workspace, but also navigating psychoanalytic spaces too. And so I remember like straightening my hair. So Ksera wore her hair curly, I wore my hair straight. I cut off my nails because I wear long nails. And so I cut off my nails. I tried to like whitewash myself as much as possible. Even if you look at my picture from when I was hired at the organization, it doesn't even look like me. That's how like whitewashed it was necessary. I felt was necessary, at least, to navigate the space, to gain entry into the space, which I needed, or at least, which I needed. I needed the money. Like I needed to work. But as I continued in the organization, that sort of whitewashing continued, and I think that this is part of at least my experience of being a Black woman in these spaces. Whether we're talking. Yeah, anyways, the whitewashing sort of continued, and yeah. And I think it, until Ksera was left. Was it like left? Like
I was let go.
Fired?
Yeah. I was fired.
Yeah.
Well, because it was after, or maybe it was during the time, because I had to retake my licensure exam like 3 times. And there's an article that I wish was like widely circulated about the abysmal fail rates for people of color for this exam, and to the degree that it keeps us out of the field at a disproportionately higher rate than white people. And I obsessed about this article because we have to study this concept called disparate impact for the EPPP. And that exam is an example of disparate impact. And it just bothered me so much. But yes, I was fired because it was sort of like, if you don't pass your exam the second time, then we'll fire you. Or if you pass but your license isn't in hand by such date, we'll fire you. That was what I was told. And I wasn't offered any help. I wasn't offered to be connected with other people in the company who might have been also studying or struggling, or if I needed materials. I had to start a GoFundMe to like have enough money to get additional tutoring and studying for the third time I took it, because I was unemployed by that point. But we had met, Natasha and I and some other colleagues, I guess, for dinner or something. And I think it was at that dinner maybe, or sometime, I can't remember exactly, where you told me about something. I can't remember what the context was, but about how you were like, oh yeah, like someone said, like, I'm not gonna like Ksera's not gonna last like much longer than a year here. Do you remember this?
Yeah. Because like what I understand about navigating white spaces is the culture. There's a certain culture, and when you step outside of that culture, aka when you're actually being like yourself, or when you're being yourself, that's what it feels like for me. Then you can expect to be hit with like some sort of resistance, and that resistance can result in you being pushed out of it. And so I like the honesty, like transparency, genuineness that you sort of brought into the space. I understood that to mean that you're probably not going to be here very long, because people don't like that. People as in like folks who are in positions of power. Yeah. And I think it was like 9 months, a year or something like that later.
Yeah, I was there like 11 months maybe. I didn't make it to the year. Yeah. And I remember thinking about that because I was called by people in positions of power, stubborn, difficult. I didn't want to go with the flow. I didn't want to do what needed to be done before I could get to a position where they would actually let me work the way I wanted to. There was a lot of that. And it was difficult for me because I struggled with, well, I know that continuing to be my authentic self means that my clients are going to end up without a therapist, which is exactly what happened. And they had nowhere to send my kids because no one in the company was qualified to see them. I specialize in working with autism and various developmental delays and diversely abled children. And there was no one who felt like they could take that up. So a lot of those people went on wait lists. And yeah, I felt a lot of guilt and shame and confusion because I was like, well, I know what I could do if I really wanted to stay here. And I got that message from my supervisor at the time. She said, I feel like you don't want to fight for this, was what I was told. And I was like, I want to fight to be oppressed? Like, that's what you're telling me. So, I kind of knew that this was going to happen. And I would have preferred to leave on my own terms, but, that's how things shook out. And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna like compare that to my experience of doing the whitewashing from the beginning, of like not challenging or being my full self in the space. And then by the time I said, okay, I'm leaving, I've got like a goodbye card and like these extra time with HR to discuss what my experience had been like a very different experience of transitioning out of ending there, of leaving. And I think that I think that was in part because I played this game that that they wanted me to play, and then, or wanted us to play. And then afterwards, after leaving, I went into private practice, and I don't think I didn't get to fully experience what it meant to me. I didn't get to fully be me until that experience of going into private practice. And so what all that has meant is like writing. So I began writing, and I've published a couple articles, and working with folks who I find myself drawn towards and interested in working with, like finding my voice more like fully within the psychoanalytic community, presenting at conferences and this sort of thing. And yeah, I don't think my like full self was allowed to flourish until I went into private practice, which was 2018, just a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny because so that was what, December for you? 2019?
18.
18? Yeah, 18. Lord time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been fired in August. I was unemployed for 6 months. And during that time, I was like, how do I start a practice with no capital? And I was meeting with you and other BIPOC clinicians, because one was also starting, left the same company and starting her practice. And we were sharing resources with each other. And I remember being in these conversations like, oh my gosh, I'm starting this from a totally different place. Like, I'm not licensed yet. I need to get paneled. So the transition was very, very rough. And I wasn't sure I like what getting new clients would look like. And I think this speaks to the relationship and the work that I had done with people. But at least 2/3 of the people that I worked with at the group practice found me. They hunted me down and they found me. And so I started with people that I used to see. But it was on a hope and a prayer, pretty much. And then I also was seeking out part-time work. So I did end up getting employed with the juvenile court clinic as well. Because I still wasn't entirely sure I wanted to start a full-time private practice. But I still wanted to do that assessment work. So in a way, I still ended up in a forensic context. But I feel like that work is happening more on my own terms. There's still systems stuff, but I'm trusted. My expertise is valued. I was put in a leadership role like 4 months into my time there as a testing coordinator. And I feel it's been just a very different experience to know that your training and your expertise and your labor is valued. And also feeling free in my own practice to work the way I'd like and conceptualize and, think about. I felt more free to think. And I think it's important for me to add that I had gotten really sick in the last few months of my time at the group practice. My migraines, which had not been around for almost 2 years, had flared up really badly. I was in paralyzing pain. I was laying down on my couch in between sessions just to catch some time before I'd have to sit in pain through another 45-minute session. So it really, the environment and the trauma of being in that place took its toll on me. And different from Natasha, I actually kind of retreated from the psychoanalytic community during the last couple of years because I felt like I just couldn't continue to deal with abusive systems. And I'm only sort of more recently getting back into things. So I represented at the American Psychoanalytic this year after being gone for 2 years. And I'm getting back into writing. But I had to exit for a bit because I was pretty traumatized by that experience.
Thank you so much for sharing these stories. It's really moving and powerful. And I definitely want to link to this article about the EPPP because that sounds really, really important for people to be able to access. And any other resources that you want to share. But I find it most frustrating in the psychoanalytic community because the theory, is supposed to be about helping people find their kind of individual way of being and speaking and understanding themselves in the world. And yet these systems and these institutions, the hierarchies in some place are so normative, so exclusionary. They're completely the opposite of what at least I see the theory is supposed to being about. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Do you want to start, Natasha? I have so many thoughts. But...
Oh, no, I'll go ahead. I'll let you start.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about how I felt that psychoanalysis gave language to my experience of migration. And I wrote about that too in my application to be a fellow at the American, which I was from 2016 to 2017. I wrote about that, really feeling drawn to how it was about movement and exploration and freedom, and finding that language to be so valuable, even if it's not necessarily language that I'm using with clients, but it my theory of mind. And I think about how, many immigrants are drawn to object relations language, and there are reasons for that, right? But my time in the spaces, I witnessed a lot of racism, a lot of misogyny. I mean, there were times where I would try to approach speakers that I wanted to talk to, and old white, psychoanalysts, men usually, would step right in front of me, and then just take up the space, and I would miss my opportunity to speak with someone that I wanted to speak with. Or people would say things like, "Well, all women want to be subjugated." I'd hear things like that at conferences. Or someone would say, "Well, my niece got raped or whatever, and she deserved it because of how she was dressed." And these are the things that people say in these spaces. And you try to challenge them, and then other people, usually other women, white women, lean over and they'll do something like, "Oh, are you sure you want to say something?" I've had that happen. And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" And I'm like, "Well, you just have to be careful." "Well, what do I have to be careful about?" "Well, you could lose referrals." So that's and so these things are allowed to play out, and we elevate these people who are engaging in this violence. Really, I think is the only thing to call it, and they never get challenged because they're venerated and they're highly, acclaimed and well written, but it's violence and abuse of power. And that's what made it really hard for me to stick in these spaces. And why, in the interest of self-preservation, in lieu of the trauma I experienced leaving the practice, I felt like I couldn't do it.
I've just found Vanessa, can you repeat what the question was?
Just any thoughts about how psychoanalytic theory, the theory seems to me to be so about finding your own voice and individuality and not judging anyone's sexuality or preferences or way anybody was developed. yet the institutions are so like dogmatic and rigid and racist and oppressive and misogynist and just like completely normative, and they're like totally the opposite, and they exclude people. Or even what you spoke to about like having all of this student loan debt, you know. I also came out of school with like a couple $100,000 worth of student loan debt, and then like psychoanalytic training on top of that. Like for me, for example, I'm like working in the hospital, you know, for my paycheck from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., then going to my analysis, then seeing my analytic patients in the evenings for like $5 a session while I'm training, then going to classes at the institute from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., you know, and then, you know, having my supervisor at some point tell me, like, how do we know that you're dedicated enough to this? You know, like I wanted to, like, you know, change my hours or whatever. They're like, well, you're not valuing your training. It's like, what else do you want me to do? You know, it's like impossible. Like, how are people supposed to train and like have a real life in that kind of situation?
Mm-hmm. And I even think about the like the lack of representation and the impact that that had on me. Is I could not seeing someone, not seeing like in analysts or someone who looked like me, or spaces where there are other folks who were looking like me. So it was difficult for me to imagine myself even doing it, or like how to do it, or um, yeah. And actually this reminds me of that, oh gosh, what is it? It was the, oh my gosh, I guess it's called a documentary that came out in like 2011, 2012, and it's with the black psychoanalysts speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that was probably the first time that was one of the things that I needed to understand that, oh, there is a space for me here. And I remember the first time, like, I met Kirkland Bonds, and I was like, oh my gosh, it is so nice to meet you. Can I take a picture with you? Like, can you? But I think that was so important for me, for like my own, to understand that I could be in this space. I think it's hard to even answer your question though, Vanessa, because there's such power within the psychoanalytic theory. I think it could be utilized to understand, to make sense. I've been able to utilize it to make sense of my own experience, and I think that it can be utilized to make for other people in similar ways, and even to make sense of like racism and sexism and these sorts of things. So there's such like opportunity or like power there. It's just the systems that we're in, yes, can be so harmful, and I don't think
Well, not only can be, right, but they are.
Yeah.
And even Vanessa's example of like, are you dedicated? I hear that a lot from analytic people. So even when I was having recent conversations, trying to like reconvince myself that spending my money and valuable time to be oppressed in order to learn something is worth it. The lip service that I got was like, well, if you're dedicated enough, if you really want this, then you'll do it. And it feels like really icky. It's like an abuser. And it's the only thing I can like is the only parallel I can think of, especially in my work with sexual trauma, you know, that really icky, like, if you really want this, then you'll do it. And how many analysts say that to those of us who are thinking about training? As if, because I'm worried that I'm going to be oppressed, that means that I'm not interested enough. And I find that to be so I guess disgusting is really the only word for it that I can think of. And it's a way of making you question yourself. It's sort of crazy making, that abusers do to make you think that you're somehow responsible for, or this is somehow your fault. And I find that to be really difficult to contend with.
Yeah, and I think that's why I've been drawn more towards the Lacanians because, Lacan split off from the IPA, and I found that since I left the American psychoanalytic and stopped dealing with the IPA and just started speaking more with people that are Lacanian or just working outside of that kind of system, and doing psychoanalysis more like independent study, like getting their own analysis, getting supervision, analyzing people that way, and studying it kind of more independently. It's been a lot more fruitful for me, at least. What are you all doing now?
Real quick before I answer that, I was just thinking about what you were able to do to navigate that, and I was thinking, I guess what I was pausing, kind of reflecting on, was like I feel like I haven't even had the like so much of my resources, my energy has been spent on surviving that it's only until recently that I've been able to find ways of beginning to thrive. And so finding, and yeah, I'm still like processing this, but I'm also, if we can pause, I don't know if this is okay, because I'm also reflecting on what this experience has been for the last hour. And I'm noticing, is this okay for me to say right now?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, okay. Because I totally am not answering your question.
It doesn't matter.
You asked like 2 questions, and I'm like, I'm not going to answer that
one. You don't have to.
No, I would totally, absolutely answer it. I was just reflecting on, like, okay, when we started, so coming into this, it was difficult for me to like sit down and like really reflect on, okay, what is this time gonna look like? And then I was like, I should probably sit down and like really put out an outline. And I was like, no, don't put out an outline, because that's just your anxiety trying to like interfere with the process, like be in the process. But I think as I'm sitting through the process now, part of where some of that anxiety was coming from is like not having platforms to talk about what my experience, at least, or like the experience of folks who look like me has been within the psychoanalytic community, like what our journeys have been. And so having a space like this feels really important. And but because I know it doesn't happen often, a part of me is like, I want to do a really good job, and I want to do it like right, and like all of this anxiety begins to come up. But if I can like move that to the side for a moment, I'm not gonna analyze it right now. I'll just move it to the side. And I think I do want to name that I appreciate the platform for like Ksera and I to share some of this experience, because it wasn't until like Black Psychoanalytics Speak that I began hearing voices, hearing like the stories, the experiences from folks of color, from Black folks within the psychoanalytic field. And I know that our journeys can look very different from like our white counterparts. And I do also know that some of my story overlaps with like my white colleagues, but a nice chunk of it doesn't. And and so the question you were asking earlier, that you had answered and Ksera's answered, and I was having difficulty finding like my own voice with it, was because I didn't feel like I was actually able to become like a psychoanalytically minded person until more recently. And that's because up until recently, I was in survival mode. And I don't think I didn't even have the space to study in the way that like I would have wanted to study, or to read in the way that I would have wanted to read, because I was working community mental health and teaching and doing all this and bringing in like $50,000 a year doing all of that, living in Boston with $410,000 of debt. And so just like fundamental needs weren't being met. And for me, working, like having my own practice. So, I guess I'm answering your question now. This is what I do now. Is I've had this private practice a solo private practice for the last couple of years. 2020 is when I had planned to expand to a group practice. This thing COVID happened and like threw some shit off. But now it looks like January 2021, I'll be expanding to a group practice. And it wasn't until this period that I think I have been able to really step into the shoes of being in like more of an analyst, like more on that path to that. Yeah, and I just felt like that was like important for me to acknowledge as we've like been sitting and talking together, because I'm like, where is this anxiety coming from? Mm. And I think that that's part of where it comes from for me. So yeah. But my group practice, my practice focuses on working with folks of color, particularly women of color. And I am expanding the practice to continue doing some of that work, but to also do more like support and coaching for clinicians, particularly clinicians of color who are interested in opening their own private practices. And because I really do see like this shift into private practice and like working for yourself as a way for, at least it's been an important stepping stone into my own liberation.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you naming and acknowledging all of that. There aren't many spaces to do this. And we may have had this conversation between the two of us, Natasha and I, but we haven't really talked about it. So it's nice to do that, but also brings up so many things. And I myself, obviously, am continuing in private practice part-time. I haven't yet decided about whether or not I would want to expand. I think it's probably coming because I get so many inquiries, because there is a need. People are looking for practices where they can feel safe, not just, finding BIPOC clinicians, but also clinicians who are, affirming and in all aspects of identity. I get so many stories from various folks in the LGBTQ plus community about the trauma they've experienced from other therapists who have really ignored important parts of their identity, and just all kinds of really terrible things. I get lots of emails that are just really terrible stories. And even if expanding means I'm training other people to be more sensitive in their work, that would be the work that's important to me, is creating more of those spaces. I'm also still working in the courts, obviously, so continuing to do assessment is a part of, I think, just I need to do that. But I'm also doing ongoing Rorschach research with a mentor of mine in the area, Anthony Bram, and some others on form dominance coding on the Rorschach. So we're doing some of that work. So I'm doing research as well. I'm getting back into that, and hopefully getting back into some more analytic writings. I came out of graduate school with 8 publications and haven't written since. So I've really been silenced in a way in the last few years. And so similar to what Natasha was saying, like finding liberation, finding my voice, and the freedom to think more clearly.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made as well, like not being able to be yourself, was making you sick. Made you sick, and being in that system, and also the fact that when you are able to be more of yourself and be more authentic, that's going to come across with your patients as well. Like I found, like in different ways, but the more I've been able to be myself in other ways, it helps other people resonate with it, and it helps them also to be able to be themselves more,
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the most fun part of my work is like being me with people and how that helps them heal. Like that's just fun. It's so it fills up the cup. Yeah.
And it's like this new privilege.
Yeah.
This is all very new. Not cutting your hair, not cutting your nails, like just showing up in whatever head wrap you want to wear. That is all very new.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything else you wanted to be sure to mention?
Well, I guess I just want to mention that, like, yes, this is all very new and very great and very fun, but it certainly has been challenging being a therapist during a pandemic. So I think it's important to name that we are, as clinicians, under an enormous amount of different kind of pressure right now. And I just want to put that message out there to any clinician who's listening. We're doing a really difficult task, but we are here. And I'm on Instagram. I started my very social justice activist-oriented platform, I guess, 10 or 12 weeks ago because I was going crazy with feeling like I was stuck in my office and couldn't do anything. So I'm at CT Counseling, and I've been trying to claim the activist side of my therapist identity during the last few months. So something to mention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll link to that.
I guess, anything that I want to mention? My reflection from earlier is probably what I wanted to mention. But I'm also glad that you named, like, I couldn't even talk about 2020. I just went from 2018 to, we doing some stuff right now. So I'm glad that you named that. This last year has been, it's been a lot. So and I'll also sort of toss in there that if there are particularly any women of color, but folks of color who are interested in private practice, interested in looking more into that sort of work, that very scary leap where we don't see many of us doing that kind of stuff, to feel free to reach out to me. I mean, I do consulting work, but I'm also open to having more informal conversations with folks. And so, and I can, my business is And Still We Rise. So you can look that up, Natasha Holmes. So I'll toss that out there.
Wonderful. And of course, anytime there's anything you want to talk about, either together or individually, you are always welcome to come on and talk about whatever you're doing or whatever you want.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for creating the space.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah, and we didn't say this, but maybe we can put it in the notes. But we're both a part of the same steering committee for reflective
Reflective
spaces,
Spaces, Material Places,
material
Boston.
places.
Yeah.
Yes. And so we're frequently working together.
Yes.
And so that's probably also part of the flow as well. And we are working on this year decolonizing psychotherapy. That's the subject of
Yeah.
our programming. Yeah, so that's important to say.
Yes, that is important to say because Reflective Spaces, Material Places, Boston, which is there's two like chapters of Reflective Spaces, Material Places that I'm aware of, at least the one in San Francisco and one in Boston. And this year, the one in Boston is focused on, or the theme for the year is decolonizing psychotherapy, psychoanalysis.
Psychotherapy, yeah.
Psychotherapy. And so we put on this monthly events, every other month rather, events. And it works out to being every other month. I think it's like 4 times a year or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that is an important thing to notice. I forget how many ways our stuff overlaps, Ksera. I didn't know the forensic overlap in the beginning until we were talking today. And then we have this
I
overlap
remembered.
I didn't. I've like so removed myself from forensic stuff from that. My colonizers. Yeah. Anyway. But there's that. There's like some overlap with the grad school. There's where we cross paths, like at the group practice. There's what we do now. Yeah. So yeah. So thank you.
That's wonderful. No, and yeah, exactly. That's why I'm glad to have this space too, because like going through this kind of whole experience, it would have been so helpful to hear other people kind of talking about how difficult this can be and all these kinds of issues that come up, because there's none of that is addressed in any level of training, all the way from psychology, grad school, psychoanalytic training. I mean, nobody talks about any of this. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Doctors Ksera Dyette and Natasha Holmes. For more, please visit the text accompanying this episode for links to their work, as well as to the documentary Black Psychoanalysts Speak, and to the article on the EPPP licensing exam and its discrimination against minorities. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. From Trapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. For more information, you can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. And dreams, let's see them. There were many small roads going higher up. His left hand, as if deciding how to answer his question. Even though it was clear that everything about this was a surprise. Walked for hours and hours, usually up to a little cabin high up where some yogis took students for short-term retreats. The sun seemingly always shone. The forests were lush and dense. The air was so filled with oxygen. The minister's only son. Metabolic system had, on a holiday from school, arrived. Illusion would only be deemed to Victor. Question allows him or herself. I'm alone. It's no trick. It's just that I have awfully new foundations. Looking out at the valley beneath them, they were all struck by the beauty. Beneath them, they could see the neat little village. Above them, the range just continued. Strain of Lucy's illness and its horrible phases is telling on me. I am overexcited and weary, and I need rest. 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 Happily, Von Helsing has not summoned me, so I need not forgo my sleep. Tonight, I could not well do without it. Disgruntled new arrivals claiming took walks together from thee come, drifted into a little nap. This was A from thee. Apparently, something was brewing. She was happy about it. If anything, he needed to be grounded, brought back to earth in a way. That was the least way to wait a day or two before starting. It was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow some semi-wild dogs join them as they sat down to their picnic. He patted them, although he knew they were probably flea-infested. And the wolf. There was a strange and horrible gurgling in her throat. Then she fell over as if struck with lightning, and her head hit my forehead and made me dizzy for a moment or two. The room and all around seemed to spin around. I kept my hello. With you, it's beautiful. the very same crystal clear transmission. Yesterday evening, he shook his human onlookers, a big ship hovering. How could you miss that?